This is Legal Nurse Podcast, the first ever podcast specifically for legal nurse consultants. You'll learn tips, tricks, and strategies that you can use in your LNC career. If you'd love to hold a book in your hands that you helped to write, be sure to pay attention to the information that I share with you during this show. Welcome to Legal Nurse Podcast. I'm Pat Iyer, and I have with me Cameron Totman. This is the show that you come to each week to get updates on the field of legal nurse consulting and meet people who have tips that they can share with you to help you in your LNC practice. We explore various aspects of legal nurse consulting, and one of the ones that we're exploring today is the concept of travel nursing and how that influences some of the case details that you may be exploring. Cameron has experience working as a travel nurse in several states. He's got a background as a medical surgical nurse, and he also has a background as an instructor in a school of nursing. Cameron also had an opportunity when he was in nursing school to spend some time in London, and he learned to look at the arrows that are on the streets that tell you what direction your eyes should be looking at before you cross the street, because it is not always intuitively obvious if you're from another country, whether the traffic is coming from left or from the right. Cameron, welcome to the show.
Hi, Pat. Thank you so much for having me today.
Let's start for our listener who may not be familiar with the term travel nursing. What does that mean?
So a travel nurse is a nurse that takes on a temporary assignment for a hospital. It's usually to fill a staffing need or staffing shortage. So in order to take on that role, a nurse is going to have to travel over 50 miles from their permanent residency and take on that assignment. So that assignment is temporary. And generally, the nurse will have at least 2 years of experience in a specialty, because they're going to have to, in a sense, they're going to have to be able to hit the ground running when they get to the facility to help that shortage.
And when you say it's temporary, can you give us a time frame for what that means?
Generally about 13 weeks.
What happens if a nurse really likes it? Suppose that nurse goes to Hawaii or St. Thomas or Fort Lauderdale in the winter and wants to stay. What happens then?
So typically what will happen is either the travel nurse will express interest in wanting to stay with their management team, or the management team will express interest in that traveler and ask them if they would like to stay. It's usually a mutual agreement. So that's the case. And if at that specific hospital that the nurse is working at, if maybe they decide they don't like that specific hospital, but they do love the area, if there's a nearby hospital, they may be able to stay in that area if that hospital has a need as well.
When you say if that hospital has a need, what would cause a hospital to turn to a travel agency rather than try to bring on more employees?
So the benefit of having either a travel nurse or in a more modern sense, an internal staffing agency, it's because of that training period. So if you were to hire on a new staff, it's going to take usually at least 3 to 6 months to fill that staffing shortage. Where if you hire an agency nurse, they come with a level of experience and they're able to take on training, which may only last them 2 to 3 days. And then they're able to do patient care on their own. So when they're training, typically the training mostly consists of becoming acclimated to the hospital, the new environment, learning their whereabouts, learning hospital regulations, but not necessarily how to be a nurse.
And I know that you've been in a variety of settings. How do you, as the new nurse, learn those regulations?
So you can learn them in a variety of ways. In my experience, I've learned them in a variety of ways. So you can get an document that will be sent to you in pre-orientation, meaning that in pre-orientation, they'll send you, or the facility hospital organization will send you tests or modules that pertain to the hospital and the organization. And within those documents will be a policy that you read over and then you acknowledge to the hospital that you've read it. That's one scenario. You might start your orientation on campus, and in that sense, you will most likely also have an document that you'll read over on in orientation and acknowledge that you've read it. I'm currently on an assignment locally, and not only did I have an document to sign, but also if I access an employee portal, I have access to that document as well. But as I had said, having that experience as a nurse for at least 2 years helps guide your nursing wisdom. But each hospital more than likely has different policies. So if you're having issues with getting access to those policies, it's always very important to reach out to either your charge nurse or your management team to fill that gap.
My first job after I got my master's was to be a director of staff development at a large hospital that had, at the time that I was hired, a 3-day orientation. And by the time I left 7 years later, we had a structured preceptor program with a 3-month orientation. And we taught them about using manuals. If you can believe this, Cameron, they were binders, 3-ring binders that we had to update constantly with new procedures. There was nothing electronic in the hospital at that time. Now I would assume that you would have the ability to go into the hospital computer to look at procedures if you were encountering something that you needed to accomplish for a patient. Is that correct?
Most everything is electronic now. You can find most everything you need is going to be on the computer. But no, I mean there's still binders. We still have binders, and you just got to be affiliated or acclimated to your environment and know where to go to find those binders. But mostly, I find everything online on the company's website, or it's pretty much what I do.
It's a much more efficient system. I remember helping the hospital go through a Joint Commission survey, which is one of the major accrediting organizations in the United States. And I have a vivid memory of a rolling cart filled with binders, and I had to go through tediously. I learned also, Cameron, that you don't pull the rings apart in a binder. You have to pull the tabs at the end either way, because you can destroy the rings if you open them up that way. And pulling out old procedures and putting in new procedures. It was a manual process. It was easy to miss one. It was time consuming. To be able to go into a computer and make an adjustment in an existing policy or procedure is so much more efficient than having a manual system.
Definitely more streamlined. Definitely, my the charting is still tedious on electronic medical record systems, but it's definitely more efficient. I definitely believe it's more efficient, and I haven't had to do paper charting unless we have downtime. So
yes, and that was an issue when we transitioned to electronic medical records, is that then people would forget how to chart manually when the medical record was no longer available on the computer.
I agree with that. Definitely agree with that.
Let's focus on the payment issues, because when the pandemic occurred, there were nurses leaving hospitals in droves, some of them to permanently leave, some of them to go to travel nursing companies who were offering them extraordinary amounts of money compared to what they earned as staff nurses, as employees of the hospital. So first of all, who pays travel nurses? Are they paid directly by the hospital? Are they paid by the agency? How does that part work?
Sure. Generally, if you're working for a third party agency, such as a travel nursing agency, the way it works is the hospital is going to pay the agency, and in turn, the agency is going to pay the travel nurse. Now, today, post pandemic, there's been an emergence of more internal contracts within the hospital. So payment comes directly from the hospital. So a travel nursing contract can be obtained going through an internal agency as opposed to going through a third party agency. So it just depends on what agreement you have, which setup you end up taking on.
Do you have any idea how much the agency takes from every hour of pay that the hospital provides for the services of that travel nurse?
I don't know. I don't. I wish I did because it would it would allow me to be a little bit better of a negotiator with them. But
Mhm.
that's another thing too is which I'll get to, but having the ability to negotiate for your wages.
The travel nurse is paid by the agency, but there are also additional benefits that come with being a travel nurse because you are more than 50 miles away from your home. What kind of compensation or reimbursement does the travel nurse get for having to move into an apartment or a house in the area in order to fulfill that contract? Before we continue, let me ask you a question. Why should you participate in a compilation book? Could this be you? You've always wanted to be published, but you didn't know how to start. When you have a chance to join a compilation book, you're intrigued. A compilation book results from an editor, in this case me, bringing together a group of authors who write chapters. How would you benefit from the experience? Your participation provides you with exposure and business opportunities for your LNC business. From a practical standpoint, it gives you a way to be a published author in far less time than it would take to write an entire book by yourself. If you were to write an entire book, the chances are that it would take months. In this case, being an author of a compilation book, you get the benefit of group promotion. Every one of the authors in the book is expected to help share the word, and you get access to all of that publicity and social media posts as being one of the authors in the book. And you also get to establish some valuable connections with your co-authors. You can join a group of dedicated legal nurse consultants who are writing chapters for the next volume in my medical record analysis book. This is the third volume that I've put together. You can get all the details by going to this link, lnc.tips/MRA3. That's lnc.tips/MRA3. There is no space between the MRA and the number 3. lnc.tips/MRA3. Check it out. I'd love to have you join us. And now let's return to the show.
In today's travel nursing world, in most circumstances, you're going as a travel nurse, you will receive an hourly wage and a non-taxable wage. So that non-taxable wage is a stipend. Now, some travel nursing agencies either do provide housing that is going to take away from your stipend, or in my experience, I usually will find a place to stay. And so I'll factor that into my bundled pay and make sure it's affordable. Um, so it can be an assistance from the travel nursing agency if you're having issues finding a place to live. It can be something you do completely on your own. It can be provided by the agency. Um, there's so many resources out there now for temporary living, Airbnb, furnished finders. You can find places on Craigslist or houses on or apartments, temporary places to stay on Craigslist. Um, but typically that's how it works.
Yeah, those are good points because some areas restrict the ability to do temporary housing. Like they may say in our development, which is single family homes, they are not interested in short-term rentals. They want homeowners to not have a revolving door of new people coming in and out of a house frequently. And
Yeah,
there's all kinds of nuances associated with that.
there are. I live in an HOA. I'm not permitted to have an Airbnb at my house. It's hard to even have a renter if I were to leave
Mm-hmm.
to go on an assignment. So there are many scenarios in which it's difficult, but they're attainable.
Yes. Well, you talked about what's happening now with hospitals shifting to having internal staffing agencies as opposed to going externally. And certainly it would be much more affordable. What brought us to this point of that shift? How did the pandemic affect the shifting nature of travel nursing?
This is really it's going to be a very mixed response to that question because there's so many factors and I was a travel nurse prior to the pandemic, during the pandemic, and I'm still a travel nurse. So I noticed there was a huge increase in pay, at least temporarily. I would say from 2020 um, all the way into 2022, and the pandemic really exploited the nursing shortage. So it created it not only were staff leaving the hospitals that they were working at to take on travel jobs, those hospitals were now shorthanded. So it was just kind of a constant revolving door. All these hospitals had needs, and so the wages would just fluctuate. Um, so for instance, I had been working at a hospital in Ocala, Florida, and it was in a rural area, and this was just before the pandemic hit. Well, I should say before the social distancing requirements took effect, and so elective surgeries had been um, discontinued. I was on a 13-week contract. It was cut, I want to say, about 3 weeks short. Now, prior to that, I had been in my contract agreement. If the hospital were to cancel me for a shift, I had the obligation to pick up any remaining shifts within that week. So I kept attempting to do that, but every time I did, they would cancel me because they didn't have the needs in that rural area. So this is just before COVID spread throughout. A perk to travel nursing, I was paid for each of those weeks that I was canceled. The Once I was canceled, I was temporarily out of a job. Once the virus spread, I was literally bombarded with travel nursing agencies and recruiters asking me to fill the staffing needs in several major cities. So instead of going to New York City, I went to Boston. And there I was able to um, I was able to see. I was at a hospital near Harvard. I was able to see the in that city they're very strict with social distancing. So the spike was fluctuating, and so I was, but being in being in that location and having I believe having Harvard nearby um and many other factors, I was able to see early life-saving treatment, such as remdesivir and platelets with antibiotics that were produced from the or that were um, being facilitated by the Red Cross. And at the same time, because there was such a there was such a fluctuating spike everywhere, there would be travel nurses that would be cut from their assignment, but at the same time, they'd be able to immediately turn back around and take on a new assignment in a very rapid time frame. Sometimes even in the same area that they were at. So it was very unorthodox. Um, I was able to complete my contract, and the by the time I had completed it, the spike in Boston had pretty much plummeted. They did give me the option to stay, but I came back home to Florida and I immediately had another contract lined
Mm.
up. Um, so during that time, not only was pay very good, but you were able to take on a job in a rapid sense because the hospitals had such a turnover, and at the same time they were dealing with the virus and fluctuations in nurse to patient ratios and having to fill those gaps. Um, so it, like I said, it was very unorthodox, and it was challenging. I mean, it was challenging for all parties involved. Um, but I'd also say, in relation to today, I'd also see very short contracts in conjunction with very long contracts. So I'd see 4 week assignments that were available. I'd see 26-week assignments that were available. And generally, a typical assignment is about 13 weeks. So as we got closer into 2023, those 4 week assignments started disappearing for the most part. They're here and there. And then the 26-week became less prevalent. Um, so we're back to mostly an 8 to 13 week period. I think the least I've seen in more recent times has been an 8 week contract available. Um,
I would like us to focus with that framework, and that's very helpful to understand how the shifts have occurred in the last part of this podcast, to talk about the risks of being a traveler in relationship to medical errors. I have concerns and thoughts and questions about that topic, and I wondered if you could share from your perspective as a traveler nurse what you have seen around you in terms of, are there in general heightened risks for a person who is unfamiliar with a system, even though that person has a couple of years of experience?
sure.
And how does that play out in the clinical area?
Being a travel nurse comes with a very overwhelming territory. So yes, you do carry experience as a nurse, but you're also entering an unfamiliar environment. You're having to learn different color codes. You're having to learn gowns, bracelets. You're having to learn the new sounds of call bells. You're having to learn the whereabouts of buttons in a room. Where's the code blue button? Um, you are also possibly unfamiliar with the nuance of the electronic medical record system. So even if you're using the same brand of electronic medical record system, that hospital might have a completely different configuration that you're used to. So now you're having to navigate that. So that's an aspect all in itself, just the nuances of the hospital. Now, being a traveler, you are at the top of the food chain to float to a different floor if there's a stronger need on another floor, or take on a completely new assignment. So let's just say this. You've worked 2 or 3 shifts in a row. Maybe on that third shift, or maybe you've picked up a fourth shift to work overtime. You may have fallen into a comfort zone with the assignment that you have, the floor that you're on, and now all of a sudden you've received report on the updates on the patients that you've had the past 2 or 3 shifts, and now you're having to float to a completely different floor and take on all new patients. So not only are you having to learn about your patients, but you're also having to navigate this new floor that you're not used to, that you haven't had training on. So just having that overwhelming aspect all in itself can affect somebody. You're also exhausted. Whether you work days or nights, they're entirely different beasts. But you might have worked the night shift, so you might be mentally fatigued. If you're working the day shift, you might be a little dehydrated. You might be a little sore from having to run around the floor so much because you've had so many family members to deal with during the day, and all the doctors and physical therapists, and so it can be a lot. So all of these things can open the doors to patient safety risks and medical errors, and it's always important to verify your identifiers with your patients. You should be able to identify patients who have a high fall risk, or make sure you're looking at those bracelets that identify as DNR, or make sure you're getting into your medical record and identifying that the patient is either a full code or a DNR. Identifying equipment in the room, the walkers, gait belts. So these are all things that, for somebody who has it, why it's so important for a travel nurse to carry that experience, because they're going to know that these are things that they need to be aware of when they're working in a new environment, or having to switch to a different floor. They need to be able to carry themselves no matter where they go. And then just be expected to be adaptable and be treated as a leader in the workforce.
I worked med-surg for many years, and I can think of situations where we were delighted to have a person from the PRN pool or somebody new come on the unit to take care of a patient who we were all tired of taking care of, whether it was usually behavioral issues, and it was a relief. Oh, Cameron is here. Let's let him deal with this person for a shift, and let's give us a break. And as looking at it from your lens, how unfair it was to a person who didn't know this individual to drop on them somebody who was a behavioral challenge. I could see how that could lead to even more frustration. And certainly we have to think in terms of liability issues for people who are not familiar with the system. If we lose a lot of experienced people from healthcare, which we are, then it's even harder for travel nurses who are not familiar with the system to come in and to get some guidance from the more experienced nurses.
I agree. I do stress that this occupation, it's expected for travel nurses to have a level of experience. I'd even say 2 years is the minimum. You really need, I really believe you need to have a little bit more than that because, especially with the increasing shortage of nurses and oftentimes there's that expression, the blind leading the blind.
Yes.
You, if you're going to be a travel nurse, I'm hoping that a travel nurse isn't putting them in a situation where, they're so new that they're expecting somebody else who's as new as them to be their leader. So, just having that adaptability and knowledge to be a leader in the workforce, I think that's very important. And being able to identify the risks that can lead to medical errors or patient safety risks.
I know, Cameron, that this conversation is going to spark some questions in the minds of people who are watching it on our YouTube channel or listening to it on our audio channels. You provide services as a medical surgical expert witness and certainly have had exposure to many different settings and understand the standard of care associated with med-surg nursing. What would be the best way for people to be able to reach you?
1906lncgroup.com, or my email, cam.totman@1906lncgroup.com.
All right, perfect. Thank you for participating in our podcast, Cameron. You have opened up the world of travel nursing for people who have never done it, not familiar with it, and are curious about it. We do know that in lawsuits, we do see defendant nurses who are travel nurses, as well as people who are employees of the hospital. And that does raise some nuances in litigation of having another pocket to tap, as the plaintiff attorneys are fond of saying. They would like to have as many pockets available to them in a lawsuit at times, particularly when there are significant damages. Be sure to hang on for a few more minutes to find out who's coming up next on Legal Nurse Podcast. And also check out our continuing education website, which is lnceu.com. lnceu.com is where I provide every month 2 video trainings or a new book that I am releasing, which I release first on lnceu.com. You receive the ability to get monthly training on topics that are important for you as a legal nurse consultant. So go there and sign up for that program and join us in our ongoing continuing education. Thanks so much. Coming up next, I'm going to be sharing with you some tips on writing LinkedIn posts and articles. Why should you invest your time sharing your knowledge on LinkedIn? Does it yield results? What are the best practices when it comes to putting together posts? Should you be spending your time saying, hire me, hire me, hire me? Or is there a more effective way of using your space on LinkedIn? You'll get all those tips and much more in our next podcast on the effective use of LinkedIn posts and articles for legal nurse consultants. That's all for today. Be sure to check out this opportunity that I'm offering for a limited period. You'll have a chance to be part of a team of LNCs who are working together and sharing their wisdom by writing chapters for my next compilation book. Go to lnc.tips/MRA3. That's lnc.tips/MRA3.